Hello and welcome back to the Remote CEO podcast. Today I have a guest, Anne, who is the CEO of Cashflow Podcasting, the go-to podcast production company for business owners. Anne has helped launch and grow over 50 podcasts, turning them into lead generation marketing channels. She knows that a podcast should do more than just share great conversations. It should drive traffic, boost sales, and grow your business. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to create a podcast that not only connects with your audience, but also fuels your brand success. So welcome, Anne. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sophie. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm super excited. I mean, I've got 2 podcasts, so I love podcasting. So this conversation is exciting for me as much as it will be for everybody else. And I'm no expert. I just enjoy talking. So podcasting made sense for me. But tell me a little bit more about you and your background and what led you down the route to get to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So, my educational background, I wanted to be a lawyer. So, I went to law school. I also went to business school because I wanted to do mergers and acquisitions. So, I went through that whole thing, got all my degrees, including masters for both, like everything. And then at the end of that, after all those years of studying, I realized I don't want to be a lawyer. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know like what is the alternative that does sound appealing to me. So as a true millennial, I sold all my stuff and I went backpacking in Southeast Asia to find myself. Eventually I did, I would say. It took a while. But then yeah, backpacking was actually really cool. I always loved traveling before that as well. But on my backpacking trip, I didn't want to go home. So I wanted to figure out how to keep traveling and how to make money online. And I eventually found podcast management as a way to do that. So this is, many years ago, way pre-COVID and everything. So there were not that many podcast managers out there yet. I think I had like pretty good timing now, looking back. So yeah, I found some clients, did freelance podcast management work for them, and from there I actually grew my own agency. So started to build a team around myself, which was even better. Like I love working in a team. I could do the things that I'm good at a little bit more than just like doing the editing and writing and all of the things that podcast managers do. Yeah, so turned into an agency. And then a few years ago, I still have my agency. I started working with Cashflow Podcasting as a podcast coach. So I helped their clients launch their podcasts, basically, and I also work with some existing clients to grow their show as well. So that's how I started, super part-time next to my agency, because I wanted to see how it is to work in a larger team, a larger organization. I mean, slightly. And I was like, I think I was like 26 years old at the time. I was like, I've always worked for myself, I kind of want to see how other businesses work. So I
Interesting.
was
Yeah.
like, yeah, let's just do that part-time. And it was so fun. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I just basically worked my way up from podcast coach to marketing director to CEO now of Cashflow Podcasting.
Incredible. Amazing. So you kind of live, eat, breathe podcasting. Basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. And I know at some point along the line you were doing digital nomad life as well, weren't you? So tell me a little bit more about that and how you managed to incorporate your work with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was challenging at times, especially at the start, because, like I said, I was backpacking, and on my backpacking trip, I was like, okay, just kind of want to keep going. I don't want to go home. So I started looking for freelance clients when I was in Southeast Asia, but I was in a community and looking for clients in the United States. So it was like opposite sides of the world. So also time zones were really challenging. And it was really difficult to balance that, to be responsive for especially new clients and getting the clients to sign up and then not overworking. Like I remember the first few months or maybe even year or longer of trying to start my freelance business, I like barely slept because I was like, I had all these ideas and then I couldn't sleep because of it because I was so excited. And then when I woke up, I did like when I did fall asleep and then woke up, I was like, oh, I got to check my email. Maybe, like new clients emailed me. So there was a lot of excitement, a lot of work, and like the time zones actually work not in my favor.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kept going, and I did like a few weeks, I think, in one place and then moved on. And throughout my nomad life, I just slowed down more and more and more. Like it went from like a week or two in one place to a month in one place, 2 months to 3 months. And now I am fully settled in Spain. And, I don't want to say not going anywhere because, well, never say never, right? I don't know if I am going to live here literally forever, but for a long time for sure. And I'm still taking trips, but I'm just coming back to Spain.
Yeah, you have a base, right? And I completely resonate with that. I feel like I am slow. I'm in the process of slowing down. It's been in a process of like the past like year, I would say. At first I was traveling a lot. No, at first I moved to Bali and I was actually stable in Bali. But then when I left Bali, and I would say my true nomad life started when I left Bali, I was moving every couple of weeks, and it's like so fast paced, you just can't even keep yourself up. Whereas now I'm like, oh, the minimum that I want to be somewhere is like 3 months. Like I can't even bear the thought of even moving. I'm in Thailand at the moment, and I think I'm going to be here 6, maybe even 9, 12 months. Like I really don't want to move right now. And obviously, like you told me before we got on the call, you've got a dog now. So you're kind of, I feel like when you get an animal, you're a little bit more stable. I mean, you're in Europe, so you can move around. Whereas if you get an animal in Asia, for example, it's so hard to move around, where it really like stables you and grounds you. So I think it's nice because sometimes you need that stability, especially if you're running a business, or you've got a really high pressure job. Like you do kind of need some stability. So going back to what you were saying around like coming up with ideas all of the time, like I can also resonate with that. Like I was always I've got so much energy, so many ideas for like businesses and stuff. But unless you're in one place to actually be able to execute those things, I think it can be really hard and you can get caught off track a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I don't regret it, I think it was such a cool time, but I wouldn't want to do it again because now I'm like, yeah, no, the stability is really good.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you always kind of look at it from what you don't have, right? And then actually, if you found stability and you're really comfortable with your life, like that's amazing. Like as long as you feel happy where you are, I think that's all you can really ask for. So nice to hear your journey, because I feel like I'm kind of coming to the point where you're at, where I'm like, okay, I want a base now. And then from there I can go and travel. But it's also great to hear how you've been able to go from freelancing into actually working in a company as well. So how was that transition? Because obviously if you've gone from freelancing, I know you've worked your way up in the company now and you're now CEO, but like how did that transition? If you'd always worked for yourself, did you have to work for any kind of like mindset blocks that were holding you back in that terms, or was it quite smooth?
Yeah, I was a little bit concerned about this too, actually. When I started working for Cashflow Podcasting, I was like, how like all of a sudden I have a boss.
Yeah.
I was like, how is this gonna be? But it was actually really easy because I started working with the founder of Cashflow Podcasting, Ben Kruger, and he is such a chill guy. It was so easy to work with him, and he gave me so much freedom. He gives everyone a lot of freedom. It was also Cashflow Podcasting was started when Ben was nomading. I think he was in the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, when he started a company. I want to say 13 years ago. So a long time ago. But the whole idea of the company was that it is really, freedom is important. Everyone just does what they're good at. And there's not many, strict rules or like lots of meetings or anything. It's like, it's supposed to be a chill company. And when I came into the company, that was definitely the case, where I got a lot of freedom. And what I really loved about working with Van is that he immediately also asked my opinion on things. I felt that he really valued my thoughts and my opinions and my experience, even though I was super young and I didn't have, I have had experience working for myself, but not for other people. But he was like, okay, like I can see what you're good at. I can see what experience you do have. And he really valued that. So that was actually really cool. I didn't really have any of those difficult moments where it's like, oh, I have a boss and all of a sudden I have to do what he says. Like that's just not how the company culture is. So yeah, it was actually surprisingly easy.
Yeah, because it's interesting to hear it that way round. Like I've heard so many stories of obviously like people working in employment and then going into self-employment, but it's very interesting to hear the other side. And I think that's really lovely actually, like that you was able to transfer all of the skills that you had in your freelance work into a company where you've just got other opportunities to learn, to grow, to work with people. You said like you like working with teams. So I think that that's a really nice way to look at it, but you still have that level of freedom, which is really nice. And it just goes to show that there are companies out there that are able to offer that freedom, which is reassuring to hear, I think, for many people who decide that maybe freelancing or running a business isn't necessarily for them, but they still want to keep that level of flexibility. So I love that. That's really cool. And tell us a bit more about podcasting then. So obviously podcasting's been around for a while, blown up over the past few years, I feel like, and so many new podcasts have started. Where did it kind of like, how did it begin? Because I don't know much about the history of podcasting, and I'm going to make an assumption that you probably do. But like, tell us a bit more about podcasting and like how it's kind of grown and exploded into what it is today.
Yeah, well, I know a little bit about the history of podcasting because it's actually been around for a long time. Like, I think it's about 25 years since podcasting was kind of, invented. So the whole thing that podcasting was is that there's an RSS feed that refreshes. So every time you post a new episode, people can find that new episode on the same feed. And that is still actually how podcasts work. So the tech behind podcasts has actually not changed, which also means has some downsides as well because we don't have that much data about our listeners, for example. But yeah, tech is still the same. And start of podcasting, it was, I think, a really, like early adapters were more like a little bit like nerdy people, I would say. And then just before COVID, like a few years before COVID, it was really on the rise to also, as business owners, have a podcast or, to start podcasts to grow an audience. And it was back then, it was relatively easy because there were not that many podcasts out there, but there were more and more listeners. Like it was gaining more popularity that way. And then COVID was the thing that really made it explode when all of a sudden everyone had time on their hands and couldn't leave their house. And everyone was like, let's start a podcast. So yeah, that was the big, big boom. And a lot of those podcasts are also not around anymore because, back then a lot of people had time. And a lot of these podcasts were also just hobby podcasts. And then after a while, people got busy again and a lot of these podcasts disappeared. Yeah. Also, a lot of business owners still have the podcast that they started back then and just, tweaked it, improved it, and it's working well for their business because, it's now like 5 years. Yeah, 5 years later. So some of these podcasts have actually grown significantly and are like really good audience builders now.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to build relationships with people, I think, and get to know you and like build that trust and credibility with your audience, because ultimately it's long form content. So it can really help you. Well, for me personally, I feel like people get to know me better before maybe they come and work with me, and they can start understanding a little bit more about me because my personality can come across in this way rather than me just creating short form videos, which sometimes you want to get so much information out in those short form videos that you don't necessarily show your full personality. For me, podcasting is a really good way to be able to show personality. And for me personally, like I've always gained loads of my information from podcasts. I feel like I educate myself through podcasts because I don't learn in the traditional way. Like I don't learn by sitting in front of a laptop and someone sharing knowledge with me. Like I'm either like I absorb by listening to other people and then implementing myself, or I learn by doing. So for me, podcast is like the perfect way, like the perfect learning tool, which is why I then felt like I wanted to integrate it into my business and use it as a way to build trust with people and get them to know me and understand me and what I'm all about, because it's way easier for me to sit and have a conversation like this than it is for me to sit and record 2-second clips of my day and then put it all together into like an Instagram reel or a TikTok or something. So why do you think it is such a good tool for business owners, and like in what kind of businesses would you recommend use it?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's that trust builder, right?
Yeah.
It is absolutely a trust builder. So to answer your question, for what businesses is podcasting like the channel to go for? I would say businesses where you need a lot of trust for people to sign on to work with you. So at Cashflow Podcasting, we work a lot with financial advisors. or coaches with a high ticket offer, like executive coaches, for example, and startup founders as well, because they need to establish their thought leadership in new industries. So in all of those cases, trust is super, super important. And it's just such a credibility booster as well, right? So the cool thing about podcasting is you see the best results, or like the most of what's possible, let's say in 6 to 12 months after launching a podcast and of consistently releasing content. But just launching a podcast and doing it well, that's already a credibility boost right away. Like literally episode 1 could be that people are like, oh, like she has a podcast now. Cool. Okay. So, that's legit. If you do it well. So that's so cool, but it is exactly like you said, it is that trust builder through long form content. And you're also just having your platform to say what you want to say, right? I think especially when you have like services in your business, I think it's really important. And you usually have a lot of information that you want to share, and a lot of information that people need to know before they can be sold on your service. So the podcast is perfect to do that in a really like soft selling way. So not really sally, but like a salesy, but like very soft way. And then people come on a sales call with you. And for our clients, like people come on sales calls sold. They've already sold themselves by listening to so many podcast episodes, and they come on a call and they're like, okay, well, I know you, I know your service, I know what you do.
Yeah, it is. It definitely warms people up, doesn't it? It takes them from like a cold lead, which maybe they might have been if they came into your world somewhere, and then they get warmed up by listening to you through these podcasts. I think it's a really important tool, I feel like especially if you're a service business owner, to be able to put out your content in some kind of long form in this way to build that trust. So I love that. And you mentioned if you do it well. I love that you say that, because I mean, I know that I'm not perfect with my podcast, for example. Like, I'm very relaxed with it. I'm not an editor. I don't have the funds at the moment to invest in like somebody, as much as I would love somebody to do it. But equally, I've learned the skills of, I use a platform like Riverside, for example, to be able to get better quality content that I wouldn't be able to necessarily get from like Zoom recordings, which is how I started. The audio, I invested in a mic so that I've got better audio. And tell me a bit more about like what you consider a good podcast versus like not a great podcast.
No, absolutely. I think production quality is important, which doesn't mean that, you definitely need to work with professional audio engineers. Like, I think for some businesses, yes, it makes sense and it is important. For other businesses, not as important, but you want to make sure that the content is easy to consume. So if you can do that by yourself with software without professional editing, that's fine, I think. But something that is probably the most important part is being strategic about the content that you produce and how you use your podcast in your business. That's a non-negotiable. Like, you just have to have a plan for that. And we sometimes get clients for Cashflow Podcasting where they have a podcast in like one side, and then they have their business that's like slightly related, but like not exactly. If your goal is to actually have a positive return on investment for your podcast, then that's not going to work, right? If you want new clients through your podcast, you need to talk to exactly the same target audience that your offer is for. You need to find out what they need to hear. So what is your central message? And that doesn't mean that you need to be salesy at all, but what is your central message? Like, what do they need to know when they walk away from listening to an episode? And like, how do you fit it in all the other things that you do to market your business? So you want to make sure that that all the pieces fit together, that it's not just a separate podcast from all the other things that you do.
Yeah, no, I agree. I actually transitioned this podcast. So it previously was called the Commerce Club Podcast, because my old business model was very much focused around like e-commerce founders, e-commerce support, because that was what people were looking for throughout the pandemic, just after the pandemic, over the past 3 or 4 years. Naturally, the market has shifted and e-commerce was no longer as relevant, and my business my personal life no longer aligned with my business and I wasn't resonating with it anymore. So I'm now transitioning my business to all around like being free online business, allowing yourself to have that dream life that you want to achieve and build a business that helps you create that. So this is now more around like inspiring stories of the person that I would like to necessarily target with my online courses, with my services, for example. So I can totally understand, because I've seen a lot where people have podcasts which are so unrelated to their business, and it's like, okay, well, what's the goal here? Like, how do you want to get them to then transfer over? And I mean, some people just do it for fun, which is also fine. Like, I also love just talking, so like I would just do it for fun. But I think the other thing is that like it's very hard to maintain, right? Like it's very hard to keep it up unless you um are in like one location. For me, like that was a big problem. Like when I was traveling full time, I actually stopped doing my podcast because I just didn't have the capacity to do it and like find outreach to the guests and all of that. So what's like the ideal structure for a podcast for a business? Like, is it to release an episode every week? Is it to release them more regularly, monthly? Like, what would you say is like the ideal cadence to release episodes?
I'd say it depends a little bit. Like industry best practice is weekly episodes. Weekly episodes is awesome because it gets you a lot of content that you can then also repurpose and you stay top of mind really easily. It's not always possible, right? Like you said, if you're traveling or, if you're busy, like some businesses, they really have they have times in the year where it's just so crazy busy. Like I said, we work with a lot of financial advisors and wealth managers, and tax season, forget it. They just cannot record new content, which is fine. You just have to make sure that to prepare for that. But if you're not sure if weekly is going to work for you, if that feels very ambitious, and it is quite ambitious to be fair, then every other week. That's still fine. You can still stay top of mind, and you can increase as you go. If you see, okay, you know what, we have this workflow all under control now, we can do weekly. And also just wanted to mention that it doesn't mean that you actually have to record weekly or that you have to record every other week. I know, Sophie, you also do that. Like you record a bunch of episodes in one day and you're done for a while. You can work ahead. Like that's the cool thing about podcasting. It's not live, and you can really batch record that content. And I would highly, highly recommend it, especially as business owners with a podcast. Like you don't want to get super busy and then have to skip an episode because of that. Because, in this whole trust building thing that we do with podcasting, consistency is important. If you skip an episode, it's not the end of the world, but it's not helping the trust building. You know what I mean? Like if you tell people you're going to show up every week or every other week and you follow through, that's a trust builder. So like with the podcast, there's a lot of different things that you can do. Like the content itself needs to be a trust builder. Consistency needs to be a trust builder. Ideally, production quality is a trust builder where people can immediately see this is a serious podcast, this is legit, this is professional. And, like there's different levels, especially for production quality, that you can work with. But all of those things together are the trust builder. So, the consistency is really difficult, but it is also really important.
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely am guilty of not being always consistent with it, because it's gone through so many different like lives. I feel like my podcast and my business has been transforming. So at the same time as my business transforming, the podcast is also transforming. So sometimes I haven't felt like I've been able to show up for the podcast. But now I actually, going back to what you said about batch creation, I've batch created up until at least June at the moment. So, and we're still outreaching and doing more guests podcasting. So I'm really excited about it. And the new direction that I'm taking it in as well, I'm loving these conversations because it's all with like really like-minded people that also have the goal of freedom in their life. So I love it. It's so much more fluid and functional than it was when it was all about e-commerce. But one thing I would say I get very self-conscious about with this podcast is that it's all done online recording. Have you got any kind of evidence or experiences to suggest what style of podcasts work best? Like, is it better when you have somebody in a studio, or is it okay when it's online via Riverside or something like this?
I'd say it really depends on your goals with the podcast. If your goal with the podcast is building an audience of millions, like become a famous podcaster. I mean, most famous podcasters nowadays, they record in a studio. They record in person, super high production quality. And it then also really depends what you talk about, because if the content that you're selling is more like about you and your personality, so you're like more of like an influencer, even more important that the production quality is on point. If your goal with the podcast is you're a business owner and you want new clients in your business, you want to sell your services, you don't need millions of listeners. You know, you need a few hundred, maybe even dozens is fine, because you just need to reach the right people with the right message. Like most service-based businesses, they cannot handle like 100 new clients this month. I know, like at Cashflow Podcasting, even though we have like quite a significant team, we couldn't handle that. It's like, please don't come with 100 new clients this month. So you don't need millions and millions of downloads of listens for each episode. You just need to find the right people. So in that case, like it's more common than to have remote recordings like this, because it is very, very costly to go to a studio every time, be in person with people. It's often just for time restraints, it's just like literally impossible. But then also like it makes the podcast more of a media production than a marketing channel. So if the podcast itself is a media production, and if that is the thing that you're selling, yes, probably important. If it's a marketing channel for your business, it needs to work, you know, it like the numbers need to work, the time investment needs to work. And usually it doesn't work for in-person recordings in a studio.
Yeah, no, I've always wanted to try and do it in a studio for just to test it out and see. But at the same time, I'm like, well, I don't think that's not my goal. My goal isn't to have this really aesthetically pleasing podcast. Actually, it's to provide really high quality conversations, so it doesn't necessarily matter so much. But I think, like you say, it's become this massive media production. It makes you feel like when you're recording online that it's not going to be as adequate as maybe it would be if you're in a studio. But I think actually, as long as the conversation and the quality of the conversation is good, it doesn't necessarily matter. Because I have seen some podcasts that are recorded in studios and I'm like, well, I don't even care what you're talking about, because this interview actually doesn't have a lot of like purpose or structure. So I try to just make it more so that the conversation flows rather than aesthetically pleasing somebody.
Yeah. And I also think it's very easy for us to compare ourselves with like Diary of a CEO, you know, like the
True.
really big podcast. But also don't forget, like this Stephen Bartlett, he's like years into his podcast. Like this is not year one or year two of his podcast. This is, I don't know how old his podcast is, but like 10 years, maybe 5 years. I don't know. Like he's been at it for a long time. And he has a whole company that he built around it. And then he also has the sponsorships and things. So his podcast is the product, is the business, and it makes a lot of sense for him, because he didn't start like this, right? So when you're starting a podcast, you cannot compare yourself with a podcast like this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And what you just said there around like his podcast is the business. Obviously, some people's podcast is their business. Like they do monetize. So how would you say like is the best way to monetize a podcast? And not that you necessarily want to get it to obviously Diary of CEO levels where you're creating a whole business around it. But like some people would like to earn money from this. Like if you're creating content in an ideal world, it's giving you something back either through your service business or your whatever it is that you're selling, or you're monetizing the podcast itself. So what's the best ways to monetize a podcast, would you say?
In my experience, 100% selling your own services. So using your podcast as a marketing channel is I would say, probably easiest way and most long-term way to actually make money from your podcast, because it helps your brand building, right? It helps your brand if the podcast just fully 100% aligns with it. And then selling your own services, it's the most profitable way, and usually the way that makes the most sense for business owners to monetize their podcast. So also, if you're thinking about starting a podcast and starting a business but not sure where to start, I would usually recommend to start the business first, find out your offer, you know, have a few clients, make sure that it works, and then start the podcast if you want to be very efficient with it. If time is not an issue and you can take more time to figure it out, then you can use the podcast as more like market research tool. But usually I would recommend figure out your offer first, figure out your messaging, your brand, all the little pieces, and then start the podcast, because then you'll know what to talk about. Before then, you don't know. So it takes a lot of time then to figure out what to talk about. And the cool thing about podcasting is it's evergreen content. So if you do it well from the start, that means that every episode is a little asset that you have for your business, because it can work for your business forever. Now, I think many podcasters, like you and me, Sophie, like we start a podcast and it changes, which is totally fine as well. But my old episodes on my podcast, they're not valuable anymore now because it's not aligned with what I do. I don't want to say they're like wasted time, but if you can make sure that everything aligns with your business and your offer from the start, that means that you're building those assets from the start, and every episode really helps you towards goals of like getting new clients, growing your business, and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. It totally makes sense. And how would you say, like, in terms of what's the most important thing in terms of actually getting people to listen? Like, obviously, you can have the high production quality, you can have the great conversations, but people need to find it. It needs to be on the right platforms, getting in front of the right people, like you said earlier. Like, what's the most important part there? Because my understanding would be that it's like SEO, right? Like understanding like the keywords that people are searching for. Am I correct in thinking that, or is there like something else that would be more important than that?
I would say yes, SEO is super important. But in the end, within podcasting apps, it's practically impossible to be found. Like people, unless people search for certain keywords, then yes, they might find your podcast. But other than that, like there's not really a way for people to just organically find you without actually looking for your topic. So in general, like I would say yes, keep SEO in mind for especially podcast ads. Then besides that, you want to treat it as any other like content piece. You just basically need to market your podcast like you would market anything else. So you need to make sure that it gets in front of people. There's a million ways to do it. Paid traffic that you can send to your podcast. There is like a cold email that you can send to your podcast. There's like all the different things. But I think in general, it's really important to see your podcast as part of your overall marketing for your business. So that means that maybe it's not that important that people find the podcast directly. Maybe it's more important that they find something else and then they get introduced to the podcast. So I would say know where the podcast fits in your marketing funnel, and then see what's top of funnel, how people find you, lead generation. Usually the podcast, I would say, is usually a little bit more in the middle. So yeah, some people will find a podcast directly, but in my experience, most people will find you and your business in another way and then find a podcast. So that means you want to make sure that wherever people find you, it is clear relatively early on that you have a podcast. So on LinkedIn, I'm a podcaster and this is the name of my podcast. And, potentially here's a link. In your email newsletters, here's a link to the podcast. If you have a welcome sequence when people sign up for a lead magnet, introduce the podcast. Like it needs to be absolutely everywhere. On your website, you want your podcast episodes on your website, so you want to make sure it's absolutely everywhere, that people cannot miss it, because usually they would come into your world in a different way. But then you want them to listen to the podcast to be nurtured, and then from the podcast start to work with you.
Definitely. I think I can definitely see that it's middle funnel. People would maybe find me through social media and then click through to my podcast, or my podcast will be shared by somebody on social media and then they find me through that person, go on my social media and then click through to my podcast. So definitely would agree with that. Like in the past, I think I initially went into it with the concept of, well, could it be top of funnel? Because people surely will find you on a podcasting platform. But I very quickly realized that no, that's not how it necessarily works. Like you say, you have to market to podcasts and get people directed to that traffic. And there's so many different ways to do that, like you said.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I would say, if you, because it's not impossible to use your podcast top of funnel, right? But the question is, does it make the most sense? But if you do want to use it top of funnel as a lead generation channel, one of the best ways to get people to know about your podcast is actually be a guest on other people's podcasts.
Yeah.
Because that's how you can reach people where they're at, like while listening to a podcast. So it's relatively easy to then, I mean, you want to make sure that the call to action from that guest appearance is listen to my podcast. So sending them over within the same app to your podcast is usually relatively easy. And it's definitely podcast listeners. People are interested in a topic because that's how they found this episode, or that's why they're listening in the first place. So just a little tip, like if you do want to go that way, then
I
that's
agree with
probably
you.
something to explore.
I agree with you for sure. Like, it's definitely something that's on my radar for this year, is to get more guesting on other people's. So yeah, no, I fully agree with that strategy. And what's one of the biggest mistakes that you see podcasters make then that can make or break their success with podcasting?
I would definitely say the strategy piece. I think a lot of podcasters, don't get me wrong, I think you have to start where you're at. So if you don't have the funds at the moment or the marketing budget to hire a professional production company, and you just have to bootstrap it, it can still look and sound really good. And I think that is important. I think you have to invest either time or money to figure it out. So I think quality is important, but then also being strategic, what we already said, right? Like, where does it fit into your business? Where does it fit into your marketing channel? It just needs to be fully aligned to get the best results. So yeah, I think that is something that easily kind of goes wrong, because a lot of people also immediately, okay, monetizing a podcast, I need sponsors.
Yeah.
And I would say very often that could be like kind of like a bonus, like a cherry on top way to monetize a podcast. But if you have a business and you have capacity for new clients, then sell out that first before you go after any sponsors. Because, sponsors, it sounds so easy. Like, oh, you just record like a 30-second clip for this company and they pay you. But there's a lot more that goes into it. There's negotiations, contracts, content approvals, there's communication, there's so much that goes into sponsorships that I would say, as a business owner, it often might not be worth it, especially if you have to go out and do the outreach and start those conversations. Again, I think it's different if the podcast is your product. It's not impossible to do that, but as a business owner, it just makes more sense to sell your own stuff.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think if you can, naturally, if your subject is about your business, it should be very transferable, and you should be able to make as much money as you would like to make through that method. And like you say, cherry on top would be the sponsors. And I remember listening to a podcast, I can't remember whose podcast it was actually, but like I was listening to an episode a couple of years ago now, and she was saying that when she started her podcast, her main goal was to get sponsored, to get like somebody managing the podcast. And then she very quickly realized that it was just like completely unrealistic, and actually she needed to go back to basics and then work her way towards that goal. And now I'm sure she's probably there at this point because she's been podcasting for a few years now. But yeah, it's just an interesting one, because I'd say that that's naturally where your brain goes. If you think about monetizing a podcast, you don't always think about, oh, it's actually also could be a sales, like part of my sales process. So it is, like you say, just getting really strategic of like, how are you directing that traffic? I think
because building an audience from scratch and making the podcast itself the product, it takes a lot of time and effort that you have to put into it, like upfront, and kind of like the cold hard truth that no one wants to hear. But especially when you start your podcast, no one really cares about you as a host. No one knows you and no one cares about you. So your content, like the topic, needs to be really interesting, because that's why people will listen to you. Like no one will listen to the Big Anne show because no one knows me, no one cares about me. But if my topic is, about podcasting, or like you do, Sophie, really interesting conversations about a certain topic that's like quite niche, then yeah, people start listening to that, and then they get to know you as a host, and then eventually people start caring about you. But at the start, like, no one does.
exactly.
So that makes it tricky.
It does yeah, it's all about just, it's a bit of a time thing really, isn't it? Like consistency, time, getting as many people to listen to your stuff as possible, and then it can kind of like, you can take it in some different directions from there. But the main thing would be get strategic, get your SEO on point, and make sure that your quality of the actual content that you're producing, not necessarily the production quality, but like the actual content is good and people want to listen to it. And then hopefully you should be able to monetize it, your services, your products, whatever, from there. So yeah, really good advice. Just before we close then, have you got like one top tip? You might have already said it because we've kind of covered like the strategy piece, and I feel like it's going to be that, but is there one top tip for someone that wants to start a podcast that would benefit their business?
Well, I would first of all say, I think my top tip is if you have a service-based business and it requires a lot of trust from the person you work with, then you need a podcast. I think that is actually my top tip. So it's not not really about like starting the podcast, but just like step zero. If this is your business, that like coach, consultant, mentor, you need a podcast.
Yeah.
That's it.
Period. You need
That's
a
it.
podcast.
You need one.
I love that though. Like I agree. I think if you enjoy talking, if you enjoy having conversations, if that is a way that you can really fully express yourself and get your message across, why not? Like even if it's just monthly or like just for your audience, for example, I think it's really important because it does build that trust and credibility. I think it's the fastest way, honestly, to build that trust and credibility with an audience. So yeah, no, great tip there. And just finally, before we go, I am just throwing in this question, but we spoke a little bit about freedom at the beginning. Like, what does freedom mean to you? Because obviously everything I'm doing now is all around like helping people create more freedom in their life through online business. So I'd love to hear like, what is freedom? What does that actually look like for you? Because it looks so different for everybody.
Yeah, and it has changed a lot for me, right? Like before, because freedom is probably the most important value for me. It's so important. It's always been. But now what it looks like is that I can work when I want in my day, where I want. So at the moment, that is just working from home with my dog. And before that meant, traveling and working from cool places. But now it's just like literally being able to work from home, have my dog here right next to me. She's just waking up, by the way. That is freedom right now. And that I can choose to start an hour earlier or an hour later, or work half a day when I'm super tired and I just cannot deal with stuff. That is freedom for me.
Yeah, I love that. That's very relatable, I think. And I like to ask that now because I think everyone has a different interpretation of what freedom looks like. But for so many people, I feel like that is exactly what they want. They just want that flexibility in their day to be able to work in the comfort of their own home with their pets. And like you say, I love what you say there around like be able to take a day off when you need to. If you're tired and you don't want to work all day, don't force yourself. Why are we forcing ourselves? Because actually it's not good for us to force ourselves to do something that our body doesn't want to do. So love that. Great advice there. And anyone that wants to connect with you further, where can they find you?
Yeah, go to cashflowpodcasting.com, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm sure Sophie can drop a little link in the show notes. So yeah, go check it out there.
For sure. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting conversation. I love podcasting. So gave me a lot of good tips there as well. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation.